In the early days of the First World War, the British and German armies clashed in the Belgian town of Mons. Known as the Battle of Mons, the British army was heavily outgunned and outnumbered. Despite that, the British held their ground and managed to inflict more casualties on the Germans than they suffered. However, they were ultimately forced to retreat due to overwhelming enemy numbers and a collapsing flank. Still, the British kept their wits about them and always had a strong rear guard protecting their retreat. Because of this, the retreat was eventually successful, and similar to the main battle, the British suffered far fewer casualties than the Germans did. Once word of the British's composure in the face of utter defeat reached the public, some saw it as a miracle that any of these men survived at all. Some even believed it could have been a miracle from God, because during and after the battle, British soldiers reported seeing ghostly figures fighting alongside them against the Germans. Now, these figures varied in description, but the story was relatively the same. Supernatural entities, believed to be sent from the heavens, protected the British against the advancing German army. Eventually, these figures would be dubbed the Angels of Mons, and this story continues to be one of the most popular alleged paranormal and religious events in history. However, while this may be jumping the gun a bit, I'm here to tell you that this story is totally and utterly false. It is a hoax, but unlike most hoaxes, it wasn't created with malicious intent. From the research I did, the idea of these supernatural soldiers seems to have pretty much been made entirely by accident. So I want to take a closer look at the Battle of Mons itself and kind of see just how these creatures came into the public eye, and why so many still point to them as proof of supernatural and divine intervention. As I said, the Battle of Mons was the first time the British and German armies had clashed. But there are two additional things you need to know about the battle. First, the British participated in the battle in unison with the French, who were fighting their own battle in Charleroi. Both of these battles were part of a greater series of battles known as the Battle of the Frontiers, which saw France attempt to protect their borders from the advancing German army, who had already captured a large portion of Belgium. With the capture of Belgium, the Germans threatened France from north to east, which meant an offense could come from multiple directions. So, Britain, which officially declared war against Germany on August 14th, 1914, deployed troops to France to aid them in their defense. The second key point to remember is that these troops were not your typical British soldiers. They were part of a unit called the British Expeditionary Force, which was an elite contingent of the British Army that was composed of highly trained and professional soldiers. However, such prestige like this came with a significant drawback, which was its limited numbers. I also want to note that at this time, Ireland was still fully part of the United Kingdom, and many Irishmen were also enlisted in the BEF. With that in mind, though, at the start of World War I, the BEF only consisted of about 80,000 soldiers. And while that may seem like a lot, during the Battle of Mons, they would face a German force numbering between 160 to 200,000 soldiers, which was a ratio of nearly 2 to 1. As mentioned earlier, the French were preoccupied at Charleroi, facing another German attack. This situation, though, was both expected and planned. Charleroi and Mons were neighboring cities, or they still are neighboring cities in Belgium, and the strategy was for the French to hold Charleroi while the British held Mons. By doing so, both forces would safeguard their allies as flanks against the Germans. Following this plan, the Battle of Charleroi began on August 21st, 1914, while the Battle of Mons started 2 days later on August 23rd. However, the French and British severely underestimated the strength of the German army. On the 23rd, the French were forced to retreat from Charleroi after suffering heavy casualties. By the time they did that, the Battle of Mons was already underway and had just begun earlier that morning. The Germans started the battle with an artillery bombardment near the British lines. Around 9 a.m., they launched their first infantry assault. However, the BEF, which is obviously the British Expeditionary Force, they responded to this attack with pretty shocking precision. The riflemen, assisted by machine gunners and their own artillery, were deadly accurate and were hitting targets well over 1,000 yards away. Reports from the battle later revealed that some German soldiers believed they were actually facing a much larger battery of machine guns due to the efficiency of the British in this battle. However, it wouldn't take long for the numbers game to start taking its toll. After the initial setbacks, the Germans changed tactics, switching to looser formations that made it harder for the BEF to pick off larger groups. Slowly but surely, the Germans began overwhelming British strongholds and pushed further into their territory. At first, the BEF thought a counterattack might still be possible, considering they had inflicted far more casualties on the Germans than they'd taken. But as the day wore on, it became clear they couldn't hold their ground forever. By around 3 p.m., the order came down for the BEF to retreat. Now, this wasn't a full retreat, at least not at first it wasn't. The initial order was to pull the BEF out of Mons and set up a new defensive line in a town further south. But that evening, word came that the French forces had withdrawn from Charleroi, which left the BEF's right flank completely exposed. After this, the BEF received orders in the early hours of August 24th to begin a full retreat, and eventually the plan was for them to link back up with the French forces that were retreating from Charleroi. Now, this retreat would put the BEF in an even more precarious position because the German army continued to press forward behind them. To make the retreat possible, BEF leadership relied on their freshest troops to protect the rear guard and hold off any advancing Germans. By late August 1914, the BEF and French armies regrouped to make a stand against the advancing Germans, but despite their efforts, that attempt failed, which forced both armies into yet another retreat. This marked the beginning of what is now known as the Great Retreat, in which the Allied forces fell back over 250 miles. Finally, on September 5th, 1914, they reached the Marne River Valley and prepared to hold their ground. The next day, the First Battle of the Marne began. Now, often considered one of the most critical battles of World War I, it stopped the German advance and dashed their hopes of a quick victory. This battle, and its subsequent battles that came from it, would also begin to introduce the idea of trench warfare, which would, of course, go on to define the Western Front of World War I. Now, this stalemate that sort of came after this battle began bought the Allies valuable time to strengthen their defenses and build their forces. It also delayed Germany's plans long enough for nations like the United States to join the war, which of course brought fresh troops and vital resources. All of this would ultimately help turn the tide and would lead to Germany's defeat in November 1918. What these battles showed is that victory is possible even in the face of apparent defeat and destruction. Although it would take 4 grueling years of battle for the Allies to defeat the German army completely, the initial battles and the Allies' survival against those overwhelming odds were seen by many people as miraculous. This idea gained traction in late September 1914 when a short story titled The Bowmen was published in a London newspaper. Written by Welsh author Arthur Machen, the story was inspired by the Allies' courageous efforts during the Battle of Mons. Before writing The Bowmen, Machen had published several factual reports about the Battle of Mons. However, The Bowmen was purely fictional. In the story, a British soldier calls upon St. George for aid during the battle. In response, the spirits of English bowmen from the Battle of Agincourt appeared to assist the Allies during their retreat at Mons. The Battle of Agincourt, which was a pivotal conflict during the 100 Years' War, was significant because the English were victorious in that battle against a force with overwhelming odds. After the story's publication, many readers believed that the story was true and interpreted it as evidence of divine intervention, protecting the Allied forces. This belief sort of came to be in part because Machen did not explicitly label the story as fictional and presented it in the style of a false document. In short, a false document is a literary technique that uses factual details to make a fictional story appear more believable. In this case, Mackin presented the bowman as a first-person account from a soldier who claimed to have witnessed the ghostly bowman during the Battle of Mons. After the story's publication, many readers who believed it to be true began asking Mackin for his sources. In response, Mackin clarified that the story was entirely fictional, as he really did not want the story to be mistaken for a hoax. But, of course, this wouldn't be so simple. A few months after the bowman was published, a church contacted Arthur to request permission to reprint the story in a pamphlet. The priests also asked Mackin to provide an introduction, sort of citing his sources. While he did grant permission for the reprint, Mackin once again explained that he couldn't provide sources because there was none, because the story was entirely fictional. Shockingly, the priests insisted that Mackin must be mistaken, and were telling him that the story had to be true. And this kind of just goes to show how quickly belief in such tales can spread. And not long after this, additional accounts emerged that bore striking similarities to the plot of the bowman. Unlike Mackin, the authors of these following stories presented their accounts as entirely factual. Variations after this, variations kind of started to come up within these stories. In one instance, it was claimed that the corpses of fallen German soldiers were found with arrows in their bodies. Over time, the ghostly bowman transformed as well, and sort of gave way to descriptions of different apparitions. Among all of these, the most prominent were angelic warriors present on the battlefield. Over the next following year, the legend still continued to evolve. For Mackin, this was mostly just confusing. He kind of had to just sit back and watch as his story evolved into something entirely different from its original intent. From what had started as a fictional tale about a historical miracle, had morphed into alleged proof of the Christian God's protection of the Allied forces. In an attempt to set the record straight, Mackin republished the story in August 1915 in the form of a book. In the book, he also included a lengthy preface in which he explicitly stated that the story was entirely fictional and he made it up. Despite that, many believers continued to insist the story was true, and some even attacked Mackin for denying its existence. And as I said, Mackin was just confused that his work had this effect. On one hand, he was happy that so many were enjoying his work and his story, but on the other hand, he was sort of disheartened that this was his most popular work, and it had been transformed into something else entirely different. Now, as for those other stories, you may be wondering if the authors provided sources for their claims. The answer is both yes and no. Most of these authors cited their sources as anonymous British soldiers, while others provided specific names of soldiers reportedly involved in the Battle of Mons. However, it was later discovered that most, if not all, of these supposed soldiers had no involvement in the battle whatsoever. Even after all of that, the story of the Angels continued to grow throughout the rest of the war, even at one point being used to boost morale on the front lines. That last point is pretty interesting because David Clarke, who is an investigative journalist, recently did an in-depth examination of the Angels of Mons story and put forward the idea that maybe British intelligence were behind the hoaxes as a way to sort of naturally boost morale on the battlefield. Regardless of the origin of the story, regardless if that was the true meaning behind all these hoaxes or the true reason behind all the hoaxes, the story had that effect. It worked so well that even after the war ended in 1918, the tale continued to be told and was widely believed to be true. But as years passed and a new war would ravage Europe, interest in the story kind of waned. This would continue until the late 1970s and early 1980s when the New Age movement began. The New Age was a cultural shift in Western society marked by a rise in spiritual and religious practices, especially with those rooted in esotericism. Now, I talked about esotericism in more detail in my Ouija series, so I won't go in depth here. But for now, all you really need to know is that angels do play a key role in esoteric traditions. Now, the angels in esotericism differ from their biblical counterparts, who were also experiencing a resurgence of interest during the same time. Movies, books, TV shows all began to feature angels in prominent roles, which sort of helped to fuel the fascination with angels as it fueled the fascination and also gave angels this sort of like feeling of being protectors and the symbols of as symbols of the divine. This cultural shift in both Christian religious people and people that were just interested in religion in general and the esoteric movement, all of this sort of opened the door for the story of the Angels of Mons to be retold for an entirely new generation. After this, the story began appearing in books and magazines and was being used as evidence of both the Christian God and the existence of angels or spirits. Unsurprisingly, there was no credible evidence supporting these claims, but this revival would sort of firmly embed the Angels of Mons within popular consciousness, especially among religious, spiritual, and supernatural enthusiasts. As is often the case with topics like this, the renewed interest attracted a lot of hoaxsters. Most famously, in 2001, a man named Danny Sullivan claimed to have discovered a trunk in an antique store containing items that supposedly contained proof that the Angels of Mons were actually real. Sullivan specifically claimed to have found the trunk in an antique store in the Welsh town of Monmouth, which interestingly is the neighboring town of Caerleon, which was the hometown of Arthur Machen. Inside the trunk, Sullivan reportedly discovered the belongings of a World War I soldier named William Deutsch. These items were a diary, a photograph of angels, and even a film that supposedly captured the angels. According to this diary, Deutsch recounted an encounter with an angel years later at Woodchester Mansion alongside an American soldier. Now, Woodchester Mansion is this unfinished Gothic-style building in England, which is located roughly an hour away from Monmouth, and has its own sort of rich and eerie history of its own. And since it's a place that's often rumored to be haunted, it's a place where tales of spiritual encounters wouldn't really seem out of place. This story quickly gained widespread attention, with major publications like Variety and the LA Times running articles about it. There were even rumors circulating that film directors were offering hundreds of thousands of dollars for the contents of the trunk to create a movie about the angels. However, in 2002, Sullivan revealed in a documentary that the entire story was a hoax. When asked why he did this, he admitted that it was all crafted to sort of drum up interest in Woodchester Mansion, and that the film, the photograph, and even William Deutsch himself had never truly existed. Still, despite everything, many people continue to believe in the existence of the Angels of Mons, and in my opinion, this persistence stems from how the story is often presented today. Take my own experience as an example. The first time I ever heard the story was either through a TikTok or an Instagram reel sometime 3 or 4 years ago. And in the way that it was presented in a way that made it seem not only plausible, but possible, even real. But it conveniently left out the fact that it has been repeatedly disproven and labeled as fiction. To this day, I still occasionally come across another reel or short about the angels, and many creators still overlook this context. And I think this, unfortunately, kind of reflects the current state of the paranormal community. I often see paranormal-themed TikToks, TikTok pages, Instagram accounts, YouTube channels that all cover these types of topics like I do, but they never question their legitimacy. Now, to be fair, some of these topics do require extensive research to uncover their flaws, but that's definitely not the case here. From the very beginning, the story was entirely fictional. Yet many people, especially within religious and paranormal communities, have this. They're so. People in these communities are so eager to reinforce their beliefs that they'll cling to anything, even in the cases where there is overwhelming, or in this case, concrete evidence that disproves the entire thing. And what I think many people who do this sort of thing fail to realize is that this kind of thinking ultimately harms their own communities the most. By overlooking obvious flaws in these stories and continuing to push a narrative that they're real, only makes the individuals within these groups appear more gullible. Now, I personally can't speak from a religious perspective, but as someone with a deep and passionate interest in the paranormal, which should be obvious, this sort of thing can be very frustrating. Already being part of a niche area of belief that is constantly scrutinized by skeptics, the last thing we need is for people to ignore these clear falsehoods, and in doing so, make all of us look frankly stupid. But with that small rant over in this conclusion, I do like this story as a work of fiction. I've always had a soft spot for stories of alternate history, and as someone with a particular interest in wartime history, this story does itch a specific part of my brain. But besides that, I don't think I really have too much left to say in terms of the story. But what I will say now, and I'm going off script here now, is that I want to thank all of you for the continued support on my videos. I am sorry for the delay in the recent uploads, but there has been a lot going on personally, and with the holidays, obviously, it's been hard to find any real time to work on anything. But besides all that, I hope you all did enjoy this video. If you did, I would appreciate it if you could leave a like, leave a comment, or subscribe. Do all three. That would be the best. But if you do any of that, that way I know you all enjoyed it. And besides that, I don't think I really have too much to say. So as always, I hope to see you all again soon.